Everybody, welcome back to an interview with Dr. Timothy Noakes, Professor Timothy Noakes. Let me read his bio. Professor Noakes hails from South Africa. He got his MD degree, which is a different name in South Africa, not that it matters, but he is a medical doctor, and then he went on to do his PhD in advanced medicine, get his PhD in medicine, in exercise science. He's now an adjunct professor at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Following his retirement from the research unit of exercise science and sports medicine. In 1995, he was the co-founder of the now prestigious Sports Science Institute of South Africa. And for much of his academic career, he was rated an A1 scientist, which is the highest possible rating indicating a world-leading scientist. Basically, this means that he is widely cited. He has published over 750 scientific books and articles. He's been cited more than 21,000 times in scientific literature and has won numerous awards over the years. And he's made himself available to many, many different editorial boards. In 2008, he received the order of, I'm going to make this, I'm not going to get this right, but it's the Mapangawi Award from the President of South Africa for his excellent contribution in the fields of sports and the science of physical exercise. Now, what's really fun about Professor Noakes is that he was obviously an athlete himself, a runner, and wound up with diabetes. And wondered, how is this possible? How is this possible? I eat whole foods. I am a world expert in exercise and sports and nutrition. Like, what the heck, right? And then he started to realize something's not right here. And all of the whole paradigm around how athletes have to carbo load and eat lots of carbohydrates to keep sugar in the blood and glycogen in the muscles, right? He has gone on to scientifically prove that that was misguided information and has led to many athletes winding up with erratic blood sugars, pre-diabetes, or full-on diabetes. So welcome, Professor Noakes.
Thanks, Florence. And as I was listening to you, it struck me there was a tweet this last week, because I think last weekend, an athlete broke the 7-hour barrier in the Ironman triathlon, which people thought would be impossible.
Wow.
So he was obviously helped by a lot of people, and they had people, when he was cycling particularly, there was a phalanx of people cycling before him, and that made it a lot easier. But he published he was measuring his continuous glucose monitor, and he's frankly diabetic, because this is meant to be saying, you see, this is what you should be doing. And his glucose, he gives himself a glucose tolerance test at the start of the race. So he clearly took a high carbohydrate load just before the start. And during the swim and the early bit of the cycle, his glucose shoots up into the diabetic range. And this is being reported. See, this is fantastic. The man will never run out of glucose in his bloodstream. Well, he might have a few other problems in the due course, as I did. So it was really interesting, because they didn't get the link. They don't get the link that too much carbohydrate is going to be a problem, even for the world's best athlete performing this unbelievable performance. He has a diabetic glucose tolerance curve while he's doing it.
Wow. And is it the case? So if I was an athlete wanting to win awards or break records, and I'm thinking, okay, I just got to really jack up on sugar. Can you perform at that level for someone who's fat adapted or both? I can burn both glucose and fat. Like, can you reach those kind of levels of excellence in terms of sports?
Yeah, that's a great question, because unquestionably in the Ironman can. And because it's such a long event that you're going to be burning fat mainly in the later half, or later 2 hours or 3 hours. And in fact, one of my great friends is Dave Scott. And Dave Scott won the Ironman 6 times in the early years. He was the reason why the Ironman took off. And when he won it, he was a vegetarian. And then he realized after about, I think, 5 or 6, that he needed maybe a little more fat. So he started to eat fish, particularly salmon. And he found that helped. And he came back at the age of 40 and finished second. And he said by then he'd already changed his diet. He then read the book that we wrote, The Real Meal Revolution, which is interesting because it's a South African book, and there he is in California. He read it. and he changed his diet. And we had a long discussion. He said, Tim, if I'd followed your diet when I was the Ironman champion, I would have finished 40 minutes faster. so that's, and he said also that he would never prescribe a high carbohydrate diet for the athletes that he trains. He said, because they wear out quickly. If you're eating too much carbohydrate and you're exercising at that high level, you eventually wear out. So we have done some studies which are coming out quite soon, and they have shown that if you're fat adapted, you can burn fat at enormous rates, much higher than anyone's ever measured. And particularly you can measure it during high intensity exercise, which is completely contrary to what we are taught. We're taught that when you're running fast, you're burning carbs 100%. We found that's not true. That's only in people who can only burn carbs. But if you can burn fat, and if your body's depleted of carbohydrates, you'll burn fat at enormous rates. So I think we're in for a big change in due course. The problem is that there's such cognitive dissonance. If you committed to carbs, you committed to carbs. And that's the problem, that these athletes don't want to change. And so they will continue to eat carbs. And of course, they're being encouraged to by the industry that often funds them.
Right. All those little gel packs and all those things that I used to be a long distance runner too. And yeah, you'd stop off at the water station and they'd offer you these little sort of glucose packages of who knows what. I always turned them down because even as a sugar addict, I just wanted water. But interesting. So
Florence, I must just tell you, you know who designed those first little packets?
Not Professor Noakes. Oh,
I'm guilty.
Oh, no way. Oh my gosh.
It wasn't actually me. It was three of us. And we were working for a company, a South African company. And they came up with the idea. We said, well, you must provide carbohydrates, but then how do you provide carbohydrates to people who are running? So that we had little belts where you put these little sachets into your belt. And it was called FRN after three of us, Fordyce, Rose, and Noakes. And Fordyce was the winner of the Comrades Marathon, which is this 90-kilometer race. And he was the main driver, and he was one of the greatest South African athletes. And so people followed what he did. Well, we are great friends. He's probably my best friend. And we converted him back to a high-fat diet. And he said also he would have run 10 minutes fast in the Comrades and would have won another few if he'd never gone on the high-carb diet that I prescribed for him. We're still friends, but he does remind me that I cost him a few Comrades marathons.
But how could he have known how much faster he would have run being fat, burning fat instead of carbs?
Okay, I'll tell you why. Because at the age of 56, he converted back to the high-fat diet, and his marathon times in the New York City Marathon, he broke 3 hours. He ran 2:56 at the age of 56. And he realized, that was way faster than he was running at that time. And then he started running in the Comrades again. Although he was 2 hours slower than when he won the race, he was an hour and a half faster than when he ate a high-carb diet. So he realized that with age, and we all realized we were insulin resistant and we had to change our diets and eat more fat. So the third runner, who had run a 2:08 marathon in his career, which is pretty fast, and it was very fast 20 years ago or 30 years ago when he ran it. And he also became insulin resistant and had to change.
Really?
So the three promoters of this high carb diets, all of us got insulin resistance, and I got diabetes.
Wow, interesting. And what sort of how did they know they were insulin resistant?
Well, they got progressively fatter, and we ran slower and slower and slower. And then ultimately we went and had our blood glucoses tested and insulin tested, and found that our insulins were high, and mine were just through the roof. And then I obviously had an abnormal glucose tolerance test as well, which showed that I was diabetic.
Oh my gosh, interesting. So this guy that you just recently talked about in the news, and he was following they were sharing his blood glucose numbers. He shot up into the diabetic range, but isn't that unusual? Is that undesirable that when you're exercising, your blood glucose would rise that high? What's the alarm in that?
Yeah, that's a great question because, well, you see, it's out of we keep our glucose at 5 or 90 in your units. So it's either 5 millimoles or 90 milligrams. And it should be that the whole time. It shouldn't, you don't want to deviate. Why does the body keep it at 5? There has to be a reason, and that's because that's the safe values. Once you get out of that range, you start to get problems. What it shows is that his body can't regulate his blood glucose under the stress of exercise and a high carbohydrate diet. Normally you'd think, well, if you took lots of carbs, you're going to burn it, but he clearly wasn't. He wasn't able to distribute it through his body and to use it as a fuel, initially at least. So the high glucose level is damaging to your body. But the point was that he was, every time an athlete takes a high carbohydrate load, they're doing a glucose tolerance test on them. Now, we do a glucose tolerance test to prove whether you're healthy or sick. So he tested himself and he proved he's sick. But he won't yet realize that. Interestingly, he's a really big guy. He looks more like a football player than a triathlete. But I'm not, that's perhaps an overstatement. He looks like he would do well on the football field, American football field. So he's probably might be 80 kilograms, which is very heavy for a triathlete. He's a big guy. And even then, well, maybe that being bigger is a predisposing to diabetes.
So interesting. So the world has gone keto crazy, Professor Noakes, for good reason, right? There's lots and lots of research that's emerging that it's a therapeutic intervention in a world that it was way far off on the refined carbohydrate. We've damaged our metabolism. The pendulum has swung back, low carb. Let's bring in some healthy fats, more proteins, veggies, that kind of thing. But earlier we were talking about how keto isn't for everybody. Can you tell me a little bit about some of your experience with that?
Yeah, definitely. So when we published the book, The Real Meal Revolution, in South Africa 10 years ago, we did get feedback from our people who'd bought the book, and about 10% actually put on weight on the diet. And we subsequently learned the reason was that they were still eating a bit of sugar, and they were overeating on the fats, because that we'd given them, many of these people probably had been restricting their diets before, and now we'd given them, just as long as you're eating fat, you can eat as much as you like, sort of thing, and they did. And so they put on weight. But there are always individuals for whom it doesn't work. And I mentioned that I've just been in discussion with a lady who it was a disaster for her when she went keto. And I said, obviously you must go straight back to the diet you were eating and then maybe slightly change it. But for you, it was too far. I've had athletes tell me when they went on to 25 grams of carbohydrate a day. I remember one guy said he couldn't get out of bed. He was so exhausted. So I said, well, go up to 50 and 100. At 100, he was perfect. He said, unbelievable. Now everything is right. So, but for me, 100 makes me diabetic and will kill me. That's the difference. Everyone is so different that you have to be wary, because we can't predict. I always say this, in an experiment in the laboratory, we take 10 athletes and we're going to get 10 different results, and then we average it. And there's going to be outliers on both sides. And you could be more to the one side or the other. And so, but then we report the average, and then everyone says, oh, you see, this is what's going to happen if I do this diet. And that's nonsense. You could be the outlier on either side. It could be much better for you, or it could be not as good for you. So, but that's the beauty of this, is that people can find out very quickly whether it works for them or not. And if after a few weeks or months you find, gee, I've noticed no benefit, then the diet's not for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that what we're doing with people who are higher carb, lower fat, but everyone needs to be whole foods. Like we're all in agreement on that.
Yeah.
It's just a question of what ratio of macros work for your particular body. And you've worked so hard to make space in the conversation around nutrition to say, listen, healthy fat, the low carb, healthy fat, high fat, like healthy fat is a very powerful therapeutic intervention, and it can work for some people. And don't carte blanche rule out keto as, as lifelong way of remaining healthy and strong, and right. And then we just have to stop all the fighting amongst the people who are advocating whole foods, so that we can actually have a big lots of options in terms of what are the ratios and macros that work for my body and experiment. So how can people begin the journey of figuring out if a lower carb, higher fat meal plan would work for them? What would it look like, and how do they know if it's working for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the first thing is how you feel on the diet. And it's great because I came in feeling terrible. And within 2 days, I thought felt magic again. So for me, it was very easy. So that's the problem. If you're very unhealthy, you'll notice very quickly the benefits. If you start unhealthy, it's going to be a little more difficult. I think that you really do need measurements and to monitor, but I'm not talking about masses of measurements. I think you need to find out what's your extent of your insulin resistance. And the single best test is your fasting insulin. So if your fasting insulin is above 6 or 8 of the units, and I never quite remember what the units are, whether they're different in America or not, but those are the purposely European units. And if you're above that, you're eating too much carbohydrate and you need to reduce. That'll be the first thing. The other will be the continuous glucose monitoring and see what happens. How low can you get your glucose, and how does it spike after different meals? And if you can keep the glucose down, that will be great. We've mentioned why am I concerned, but one of the studies we've recently done, and we haven't published yet, but we've done the analysis, was of 10 athletes who went on the high carb diet or the low carb diet, and they crossed over. So all the 10 had done the high carb and the low carb. And what was remarkable was that 3 of the athletes, now these are healthy 20-year-old, not 20, 25, 30-year-old athletes, they're in the prime. And 3 of them became pre-diabetic on the low carb, on the low fat diet. Yeah, you could tell that they were outliers. The other 7 were okay. They didn't show much difference. But these 3 went up like that. And the moment they went back on the high fat diet, they come completely normal. On the high fat diet, you couldn't tell who was the problem and who wasn't. They all looked fantastic. But on the high carb diet, those 3 stuck out. Now, those are 3 of 10 healthy athletes running 80 kilometers a week, able to run quite fast. And they were the hidden. That's the 3 hidden ones. So if they reflect on the general, but these are healthy. Imagine if they weren't healthy, it wouldn't be 30% who have a problem. It would be 40, 50, 60%. So I think that you need to know how insulin resistant you are. And if your insulin is low and you're eating lots of carbs, you're probably fine. But it's not going to be like that all along. So you'll have to start changing the macronutrients, and you're going to have to increase the fat and protein and reduce the carbs. I think there was another thing I read, which I think was really helpful to me, was, I haven't got the book here immediately at hand. Yeah, so in fact, it's underneath here. That's why it wasn't. Ketones, the fourth fuel, which is the history of what we discovered about ketones and who were the guys who made the discoveries. And a guy called George Cahill, who did the first starvation studies, I mean, he was very brave. He took people and studied when they fasted for 30 days or 60 days. And then they even injected insulin into them when they had been fasting for 60 days. And their glucoses fell, and they didn't even notice it because they had so much ketones they were burning in the brain, they didn't notice it. But he said a beautiful thing. He said, there are 2 metabolic states. There's one high insulin, there's one low insulin. And that's it. And you have to choose. Obviously, the low insulin is ketogenic, and you're breaking down fat and you're generating glucose in the liver. Those are the 3 characteristics. Whereas if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, you've got a high insulin, you are breaking down glucose and you're inhibiting fat. And in fact, you're inhibiting fat use, but you're building up fat. And that your fat is now getting transported into other tissues. And that's the problem, because you're transporting it and you're building it in the liver and in your other tissues. And that's the problem. And that's what leads to insulin resistance. So to me, that's the simplest. It's high insulin or low insulin. And the lower the insulin for most of us, the better. But not for everyone, but generally, we're in a world where, particularly now, if you've been a child and you've been exposed to high carbs, high sugar, your insulin's going to be high and your body's going to be in the high insulin state. And that you don't want to keep the high insulin state for more than 10 or 15 years, then you want to change it back to the low insulin state.
What's so wrong with being in a high insulin state?
What's the problem is that you've got all these pathways activated in your body, and your liver is struggling because it's got to get rid of all this excess carbohydrate if it can't store it in the liver or the muscles. So it converts it into fat. And then that fat is distributed amongst your internal abdominal organs, and you get this visceral obesity that is so prevalent. I mean, it's just now everywhere you see, everyone's got visceral obesity. And that's a sign of metabolic distress. And as a consequence, you'll have a high insulin, you'll have high glucose, you'll have low HDL, you'll have high triglycerides. And your lipoproteins, the cholesterol that's being carried in your bloodstream, is in a damaged state. And that then your brain eventually becomes insulin resistant, and you look towards dementia, and the high insulin state promotes risk of cancer and so on. So it's just not the right state to be in. The chronically low insulin state is the way you want to be.
Right. Which is really more natural to how we ate before we had all these refined carbohydrates came in. We were all mostly low carb. I mean, we would have had potatoes or things from the garden and, probably some whole grains. But before we're metabolically damaged, we ate largely lower carbohydrate, didn't we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the Plains Indians of North America are just a classic example, because when they were examined by the early settlers, they were just unbelievably healthy. They were powerful, strong, very vigorous people with no diseases other than what we gave them with smallpox and measles, but they were healthy. There wasn't diabetes and heart disease. And they were incredibly tall and incredibly strong. And then we took away the buffalo, and tragically they went into metabolic syndrome. And now that one of the populations with the highest rates of diabetes, as are the Australian Aborigines.
Yes.
They were highly designed to eat high-fat diets, and now and as soon as you take that away, those populations are worst at risk. Those of us who have some sort of link to Europe, we tended to be better for whatever reason. We can cope with a little bit more carbohydrate. And I think if you from Asia, you can cope with much more carbohydrate, because those populations have been eating carbs for 18,000 years. So they've had some selection out. But that's the small percent of the population. So it's quite true that there are some populations that can get by on carbohydrates, but in the North America and the European countries, by and large, we're still needing our bit of fat and protein.
Right. And plus, of course, there's a huge difference between healthy whole carbohydrates and all the processed junk that can very quickly swamps our bloodstream and spikes our insulin. I think the Plains Indians, because that's actually where I live, that's my neck of the woods.
Where is that?
Alberta. I'm in the prairies of Canada.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't know that they were all that high fat, but they were definitely paleo. Like they made something called pemmican, which was Saskatoon berries and buffalo, and they ground it up and they dried it, and they had that throughout the winter. But I don't know how much fat was on the buffalo.
Yeah, they would have eaten the bones, the bone marrow and the brain. I think that's where a lot of the fat came from. But they also would select out the best animals, the ones that were the fattest.
Yeah.
So in Africa, they knew which animals to select, and they'd always go for the fittest animals, which was, of course, if humans were poor hunters, they couldn't have caught the fittest animals, but they did. Yeah. Because they became such effective hunters. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the indigenous folks in this area were very, very smart. What they did is something called a buffalo jump. And then once they got access to horses, they surrounded them all sides, whooping it up, and they were driving these buffalo, and they drove them over a cliff, and they had plenty of food to share amongst all of the area for many.
And then they turn it, as you said, they turn it into pemmican, which has a life expectancy of about 50 years.
Does it?
Yeah, no, it never goes off. It's amazing. Wow. No, there's no preservatives in.
None, no.
The whole of Canada was opened up because of pemmican. Without pemmican, there could never been the people who hunters and the trappers. The trappers wouldn't have been able to trap what they did.
Right. They would have all died off. Yeah. We used to make pemmican in our schools as kids when we learned about what indigenous cultures ate. So I had a question about how you're now working with doctors and dietitians and any sort of medical professional who wants to learn about how to do a food first approach, like how to work with nutrition to reverse, prevent and reverse lifestyle diseases or chronic diseases. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. So some years ago, we formed the Noakes Foundation, and our original goal was to fund research into the low-carb diet. And we discovered quite soon that is intensive and it's very expensive. And although we did some great studies, we couldn't continue to afford it. We thought we could probably spend our money better. And one of the thoughts we had was, how about educating doctors? Because the doctors are so important in influencing other people. And we also knew that doctors who do promote this diet tend to get cancelled. People don't like them in their communities. So it's very difficult for them. They all feel incredibly isolated. So we formed a teaching program called the Nutrition Network, which is run by the Noakes Foundation. And once a year, we run a whole lot of courses, which people can purchase. But once a year, we run a course for a small group of people. And so we take doctors from all over the world and they interact, and we give them this very intensive training, and they get some sort of degree at the end, certification. And it's really exciting. So I'm currently mentoring two medical doctors from Mexico, which is fantastic to be able to work with them, and they're so enthusiastic, and to know that the story is getting out into the rest of the world. Yeah.
Oh yeah, especially in those countries, those Spanish-speaking Latin countries, the diabetes and obesity is off the charts. I guess they become metabolically damaged, and then what they used to eat all the time, corn and whatever, they could handle, but now they can't. It's just crazy and very sad. It's really cool to hear that there's some leaders taking off there. So what are some of the core insight? What are some of the most surprising things that you see when people start to unhook from the high carb, refined carbohydrates, all that processed junk carbs? What are some of the things that you see?
Well, first they lose weight, and some of them lose an enormous amount of weight. We've had people lose 200 pounds on this diet, and in a sense, it's not just getting rid of the carbs; it's getting rid of the sugar and the sugar addiction. And I think that that if I've learned anything in the last 5 years, and I'll tell you where we learned this, where it really came home to me. When we published this book, The Real Meal Revolution, a lot of people wrote to me, and they'd say, I cured my diabetes. So eventually we said, well, that's not possible, because we still didn't think you could cure your diabetes on this diet. We'd heard about it. Atkins said it was possible. But these people claimed that they were off medication and so on. So we brought them into the laboratory, tested them, and confirmed that the majority, in fact, 75%, had indeed reversed their type 2 diabetes, but a few hadn't. And the difference was one thing. There was only one thing that was different. It was that the ones who'd reversed had got rid of all their food addictions. And they said, I have no more cravings. I know exactly what I'm going to eat. It doesn't matter. I can go out and go into the shops. I will not buy the rubbish because I'm past that. And then we realized that the most important point about reversing type 2 diabetes is not controlling your glucose. It's controlling your sugar addiction. And once you do that, you can get into good shape. Yeah. So that's what I've learned. So that the most important point for me is that you have to understand that the foods are drugs. The foods that we're eating are drugs. And you've got to get rid of that and understand it. And it's like any drug addiction. You can't continue to moderate. You can't eat moderately. You can't be a moderate drug addict. You're either a drug addict or you're a drug addict in remission. And I'm in remission from my sugar addiction.
But what about on my birthday, Professor Noakes? Can't I just have one piece of cake?
Of course you can, if you're disciplined, and if you it's not going to get worse. But for me, I couldn't, because that would probably the next day. I think now after 10 years, yes, I think I could. But in the first year, no way. That would have just gone back again. But again, it's how much discipline you have that that you can break the rules and still not go back to the addiction. And that's difficult. For most people, it's best don't. I would guess that I'm talking about people who lost 100 pounds or 100 kilograms. I know if they just convert back, they're gone. They'll go straight back and they'll put on that 100 pounds again.
Yes. Yes, it's a heck of a risk. It's hardly worth a piece of cake to risk it all.
No, exactly right.
What percentage of the population do you think are actually sugar addicted?
100%.
Do you? Yeah.
No, that's of course an exaggeration. I think sugar is so addictive that, yes, if you're exposed to it, you probably have an addiction to it. And it's only a few of us who are absolutely religious and we will not touch it. Yeah. So I don't know. Obviously that statement 100% obviously too much, but it is such a powerful addiction. Yeah. When I see people who have an abdominal obesity, I think sugar addiction, that's the first thing I think. And there's a lot of people with that. It's probably 80% of North Americans have the metabolic syndrome. The older guys over 40 or 50, probably 80% have got metabolic syndrome. So I would think most of them would be sugar addicted.
That's going to be very depressing for people to discover, because it isn't easy to unhook. What are some of do you address this in your training with doctors? Because it's one thing for a doctor to come in and say, hey, look, you need to lose some weight and you need to eat better and don't eat sugar. The person's going to go up going, oh man, I know what to do. I just don't know how to do it. So do you address that with your doctors when you train with them?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we have a whole section on sugar addiction and we have some great experts. And it's really interesting that the story about how I got involved in medicine was because Professor Christian Barnard performed the world's first human heart transplant in Cape Town at the hospital that I trained at. And that was a year before. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And a year later, I decided, okay, I must do medicine. And his granddaughter, she heard me speak once on the low carb diet about, also would have been 10 to 12 years ago. And she said, he's nailed it. It's the sugar addiction. And she realized she had a sugar addiction and she wrote a book. So it was the granddaughter of Chris Barnard. And she said, this is so important that when I was fined and went to trial with the Health Professions Council, she organized a petition for me, but she also organized a conference. And we had a world first international conference on low carb diets, which she organized. So that was my linkage to sugar addiction. And she's one of our key advisors on how you manage sugar addiction.
Who is that?
Karen Thompson is her name.
No, I've interviewed Karen. Yeah. Yes, Karen.
That's
Karen.
Right.
That's so, I didn't realize that.
That's right. That was, so the link is to her grandfather, who was a very brave man and very influential in my life, certainly.
That's what a small world. That's interesting. Anything else you would like the world to know based on your ever-evolving research on the topic of sugar addiction, the harms of carbohydrates?
Well, I think I'm doing some really exciting research with a group, Philip Prince's research group at Garden City College in Pennsylvania. Grove City College. And they're doing some fabulous stuff. They're really such good researchers. And we're showing that high-fat diets are fine for all performances, that there's really no difference in the high-carb or high-fat diets. And why is that exciting? Because then we can tell people, listen, the old idea that you have to eat so much carbohydrate is absolutely wrong. You can do what you like. Just eat what you like. But if you are insulin resistant, then know that it's not a good thing to eat a high carbohydrate diet for many years, because eventually it's going to catch up with you. So I think that we might be able to rewrite another part of the exercise physiology textbook, which says that when you're running fast, you're burning carbohydrates. We're showing that's not the case. You can burn fats if you're fat adapted. And I can't tell you how influential that is, because literally 95% of the dietetics advice that we're giving to athletes is you must eat high carbohydrate diets because X, Y, and Z. And it's not necessary and it's wrong. And people can eat what they like. And I think what we're showing is nutrition isn't the key driver of performance. It's all the other things. and we were misled. And so when I wrote the book Law of Running, which we spoke about, in which I promoted this high carbohydrate diet, the whole focus of the book is your performance is determined by your diet. Now, no, that's not the case. It's completely wrong. There are many other factors that are determining your performance. So as I rewrite the book, I'm going to focus on those things, that I can get rid of the carbohydrates and put in other things, not just training, but mental states and so on. Yeah. And that's encouraging. That performance is a totality of many things. And we tried to strip it down to one thing. And because I was an exercise physiologist, it was one carbohydrates. And that's not true. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah. My daughter used to play volleyball, and it would make me sick to my stomach at how much Gatorade, all the tournaments, like all the sugary drinks and stuff, right? And then they'd crash, and some of them would be weepy at the end of the weekend because they were just so hepped up on sugar and crashing, and it was heartbreaking. And of course I knew what was going on, and I tried to protect my daughter as best I could, but it's just an ocean of, we're up against a tidal wave of people who are just like, come on, everybody knows you need the electrolytes and Gatorade. Well, then just take electrolytes. Don't skip the sugar and the artificial flavor and colors and all the other toxins pouring into our athlete kids.
Absolutely.
So sad.
So this is the other book I wrote, Waterlogged. And this was 30 years of argument I had with the sports drink industry in the United States. And why it's relevant, so that this tells you the whole story about how industry influenced the drinking guidelines and promoted sugar and salt intake, both of which are unnecessary. But the night that I finished the book and sent it off to the publishers in the United States, I got up the next morning, had my worst run ever, and then received by chance on email, said lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger. And that was my introduction to this diet. And that book was written by Eric Westman and Jeff Ehrlich and Steve Finney, who are now my great mates. Mm-hmm. And I followed the diet, and that changed my life. I bought the book because I was so angry. I said, how can these good people promote Atkins's diet, which is high fat and saturated fat? They're trying to kill us. That was my immediate impression. They've been paid by Atkins and they're trying to kill us. That was my immediate impression. I bought the book, and 2 hours later I said, oops, I got it wrong. They're probably right, because it had 150 studies of low carb diets studies. And I'd not read one of them, not one of them. And I thought, but I'm this expert on nutrition and sport, and I know nothing about these 150 studies. Where have I been? And it's because it's suppressed. You just don't read it. And when I became friendly with Jeff Ehrlich and realized his amazing work, I asked him, he said, I never got 1 cent from the National Institute of Health, not 1 cent, because every time I put in and it said low carbs, the study just got thrown away. Then they wouldn't look at it. Yeah.
Really?
And his work, I was asked to evaluate it. I said, this is Nobel Prize winning stuff, because the Nobel Prize is given for people who do the most for the most good for the most people. And this diet does the most good for the most people. And he and Eric Westman and Steve Finney were the original drivers of the science, not suggesting that the only people who drove this diet, but they drove the science, and they did the original studies. Eric Westman, first studies to prove that low carbs could reverse diabetes. Sorry, he's not the first, but he was the first modern writer. The paper was just forgotten. You barely see it. And then Jeff went and did all these studies on metabolic syndrome and showed metabolic syndrome is what happens if you're insulin resistant and you eat a high carbohydrate diet. You get metabolic syndrome. And he reversed it. I mean, that's unbelievable. This metabolic syndrome, the most prevalent condition in the world, he says, well, this is how you reverse it. So you should get the Nobel Prize for that. But unfortunately, he's not ever going to get the Nobel Prize for doing that.
My goodness. What was that book that you held up that you wrote? It was about overhydration?
Okay, it's called Waterlogged.
Yeah.
Waterlogged.
The serious problem of overhydration in endurance sports. Do you actually mean too much water, or do you just mean too much liquid sugar stuff?
No, too much water. So we were the first to describe the condition of water intoxication in people who overdrink, and they retain the fluid and they can almost die. Yeah. So we first described in 1981 in athletes, and then it's a purely preventable condition, yet there have been many athletes who've died because of the pressure to drink during exercise, and it's completely unnecessary.
Really?
You just drink to thirst. That's the rule. Just drink to thirst. And that's all, the only rule you need to know. That in a nutshell is the science of fluids and exercise. Drink to thirst, full stop.
And do you think some people were overhydrating because of sugar addiction, that they liked the taste of the sugar and they were gulping it down?
That's a great question. I've never thought of it. I think they were addicted to the fear that they were going to die from heat stroke if they didn't drink. That's what was marketed. That if you didn't drink enough, you would die of heat stroke. And the one tragic lady, Cynthia Lachera, dies in the Boston Marathon. It was run at 10 degrees 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 50 degrees centigrade. 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 10 degrees centigrade. 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, when you're running at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you're barely able to keep warm. And she was drinking 1.2 liter, 40 ounces of fluid every hour. And tragically, she had two other problems. There have to be three conditions for you to get the condition, three biological responses. And if you genetically got those other two, over drinking plus that, you're in real trouble because you can't get rid of the excess fluid. They retain fluid even though they are drinking to excess. And that's why it's a paradox. And so that she would have been running and she wasn't passing urine. So even though her weight would have gone up about 6 pounds or 7 pounds, because that's the amount of excess fluid she'd ingested, she didn't recognize it because she wasn't passing urine. If she had been normally responding, she would have passed that 6 pounds easily and she wouldn't have been overhydrated. And then when she collapsed, they make the wrong diagnosis. Oh, she's got heat injury. So what do? We give her fluids. So you compound the problem, and that's the tragedy. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm slightly interested in this just in a personal way. I feel like I drink so much water, like I can't get hydrated. And I just think, what does my body do with it? But I mean, I do go to the washroom. My husband always says, where do you put all that water? I'm like, I have no idea, because it's not like I live in the washroom. I go normal amounts, but I don't know if there's just some body.
No, for some reason, we tend to drink more on the high fat, low carb diet. We tend to drink more. I don't know quite why it is.
Okay. I'm not. I come up the middle. I'm lower carb. I don't eat grains and fruits, or very rarely. So I'm kind of low carb, but I eat a lot of veggies. I'm definitely not a keto. I've tried it, but okay, awesome. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for all your work. I mean, you've been on what a roller coaster of a career, really, from being the guy that invented those little packets I used to suck back as an athlete when I was a runner, a triathlete, and to someone who got diabetes, who literally was at his knees and then finally got exposed to the idea that all those carbs he was pounding back, thinking it was making him an athlete, was killing him. To somebody who eventually got really on this bandwagon and started to say to the world, hey, whoa, wait a minute. You know what? We need healthy fats, or have an important role to play in nutrition. And all these carbs, once we're metabolically damaged, are really bad. And then you wind up in court. And that was a long, protracted, painful, like nail-biting experience. And now you're rewriting history around, the truth about the kinds of nutrition that we need to think about to be really in great top performance as athletes and just as human beings. So what a journey. It's been a pleasure to interview you every year and to see what mischief you're up to and good things you're up to. And thanks again for your time.
Florence, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for a lovely interview. I really appreciate it very much.
Have a great day. Bye, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this interview.